Hi everybody and welcome to our latest Facebook Live. I'm so delighted to have Gill Loomes here. Welcome, Gill.
Hi Sally.
We're going to talk about advocacy with and by autistic people, and it's great to have you, Gill, because we sort of connected through Twitter. A lot of the interesting things that you were doing and blogging about and speaking about, and I think in this climate, advocacy is such an important thing. But let's start by introducing you. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Gill Loomes-Quinn and I'm autistic. I'm at the moment I'm doing research. I'm just finishing my PhD, and I'm also working with an organisation called Leeds Autism AIM, which is part of AdvoNet. So that's a big consortium of kind of advocacy projects in the Leeds area in West Yorkshire, and I work there as a peer development worker. So I'm doing a lot of peer support and also kind of looking at how our service fits within like the wider autistic community and things. My background, as it were, is in advocacy. So by that, to be specific, because we're going to look at advocacy and how kind of what a broad concept it is, but what I mean by that is that certainly in England, and I think there's overlap with this part with Scotland, we have community advocacy services and projects which are available to different groups of the population. So I was working in a learning disability advocacy project, but my role quite specifically was as an autism advocate. It was quite a new thing at the time. I started doing this in kind of 2007, and there were some things about it that were kind of new and interesting, and that really kind of were a big part of my own sort of journey, if you like, of figuring things out and finding out what works and what the kind of issues are for autistic people, as opposed to maybe other populations and people with other kinds of needs and priorities. So the reason why that role was set up, that autism advocate role, was because of the kind of the awareness at the time of how autistic people who don't also have learning disability or a mental health issue, and at the time it was those of us who particularly maybe had the Asperger diagnosis, that often we'd fall through kind of gaps in services because we didn't meet eligibility criteria, so there'd be kind of nothing for us. And so in the local authority where I was working, the idea was to start by funding a role for an autism specific advocacy project, and to start there by kind of working alongside members of the autistic community and kind of supporting them to voice their needs and concerns and priorities, and at the same time kind of collecting kind of on the ground information about what the issues were, what was missing, what would help, and kind of feeding that into kind of service development and policy development in the area. So it was a really fascinating job, and one that is kind of the point that I always go back to with all the stuff that I'm doing sort of these days. I just have to say, Charlene, that my cat is about to appear in the screen. Sorry, she has to Zoom bomb everything that I do, so sorry about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, so that was kind of my starting point when it comes to autism advocacy and activism. Just that kind of idea that there were ways in which our needs were not being addressed by society, and that actually the starting point to achieve that needed to be through raising up the voices of autistic people, both individually and collectively.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I've gone since, really.
I love that language, raising up the voices, and it's great. We've got a lot of people watching, so if you want to raise up your voice and ask a question as we go, please type it in and I'll do my best to keep an eye on it.
Can I just add something to just what I've just said, because it just
go ahead. Yeah.
Kind of So one of the things that was kind of really, that became quite an issue, an interesting thing, and I didn't think of it as being so when I applied for that job and went for it. It felt quite natural to me that an autistic person should do that job, that like my autism would be, it's almost like a qualification. And as it happens, as I was doing the job, I went on and got postgrad qualifications in autism studies. Just also a side note there, one of the things that I have always found crucial in being an autistic and an autism advocate has been engaging with wider kind of research, particularly social research about autistic people in our community. Obviously, we all have individual experiences, those of us with lived experience, but our own individual experience obviously only takes us so far. And I've always found being kind of connected with a more kind of a research focus, this is getting really difficult, has been crucial. I really think that those of us who put ourselves out there as autistic advocates have a responsibility to kind of inform ourselves beyond our lived experience. These days, there are so many options for us to actually have a voice in terms of social media and things, but with that comes a responsibility, and it really bothers me that we need to be representative and mindful, and also kind of recognize where our own experience stops and not extrapolate beyond and kind of try and speak to the needs of others in the community when we don't necessarily have the data. But sorry, to go back to what I was trying to say about working as an autistic advocate in a service, I never realized quite how complex the idea of being autistic in that space actually was, and how many issues it raised for me in terms of how I needed to manage that aspect of my identity, how I would blithely go into a meeting with professionals in inverted, service managers, social workers, whoever, and I'd announce myself as being autistic, and I didn't realize what kind of impression that put across. Because of course, when we say that we're autistic in society, that brings with it a whole bunch of kind of stereotypes, stigmas, views, myths. And anytime I went somewhere and I announced myself as being autistic, I spoke to those views, and there were personal challenges with that in terms of the times when maybe my own autistic identity would be denied because, the whole sort of you don't look autistic kind of thing. And I'd kind of buy into the professional / service user dichotomy. So I'd position myself often as being thinking, well, I'm a professional, so therefore I can't allow myself to have any needs or to express that I have any needs because I have to do being professional, and it's kind of a different world. And but alongside that, of course, there's also the fact that I was doing advocacy just by being in the space. Like, it wasn't necessarily that. Obviously there was the stuff that was the substance of my job, going to meetings with people, helping individual clients to kind of put forward their needs and their wishes, and making sure they were in control of what was going on around them, and all that. But even just the fact that I was doing the job as an autistic person was a form of advocacy in itself. And I guess what I'm saying there is that we've become, in the subsequent sort of over a decade since I was there, we've become much more readily accepting of the truth that autistic people are best placed to speak about autistic experiences, and that jobs like autistic advocates and other positions are best filled by autistic people. But alongside that, there comes a particular burden on those autistic people, that being autistic professional is a challenged position. Often we kind of find ourselves in a hostile environment, and I think maybe as a community or as communities, we need to get better at kind of really interrogating what those difficulties are and how we can sort of support each other around that, because it can be exhausting and draining, and can make you kind of quite vulnerable sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, and picking up on a few things that you've said there about autistic people who don't have a learning disability, or who may or may not have mental health issues as well. There's very little tangible support that you can point there, and that idea of asserting the benefits of an autistic person, having the understanding of another autistic person. I think that's such a vital point. I'd like, could you speak a little bit about what you actually mean by advocacy?
Yeah, of course.
For some people, it might not be a known concept.
No, absolutely. I went off on a tangent there, which I tend to do, but no, definitely.
All right.
So what we mean by advocacy, I think it's important to start off by saying that it's a really broad concept. And I think personally, I find that one of its real strengths, that it has so many different practical applications and ways of doing it. Basically, in a nutshell, when we talk about advocacy, it means to do with having a voice. So that obviously we've got the vote part in there. It's kind of like being vocal, and so advocacy generally means helping somebody else to have a voice, and that might be sometimes we can do that in an informal sense. So it might be, even just if we're in a group of friends and deciding what we want to do, maybe on an afternoon or an evening, maybe you might see that one of your friends has been kind of left out of the decision making, and you might want to check in on what their views are and what their preference would be. So you might just say, such and such, Charlene, what do you think? What would you like to do? And just that giving somebody an in, making sure that their voice is heard, is a form of is advocacy in that informal sense. And so when I talk about having been an advocate kind of professionally, what I'm basically doing in a basic sense is that I'm making that happen, but in the context of a person's life and the services they interact with, and the ways in which they get the needs met. So it might be that somebody is going for kind of health related appointments or having to make health decisions, and they maybe don't feel that they can express with their doctor or their clinicians that their doctor really particularly understands their autism. This is one of the things where all of us in society will do and experience advocacy in different ways at different times. I personally feel that for autistic people, we really need advocacy is our starting point, because often the ways in which our autism impacts us in a neurotypical world means that we're on a back foot when it comes to advocating for ourselves. So often, in order to get any kind of service or support, or even the basics of kind of getting your grocery shopping done, or going to a social event, if we can't get the advocacy right, and the self-advocacy, and I'll talk a little bit about what those differences are, but if we can't get that bit right, we don't get any further in terms of accessing actual society. To speak from my own personal experience, so I'm also physically disabled. I'm a wheelchair user, and I have a range of kind of physical access needs as well as my autism. And what I've found is that for example, when I've been a student in university, and this has been quite a few universities, so I'm not singling out anywhere that I've been associated with, but when I've been studying at a university, and obviously if you're a disabled student, that means you have to interact with the kind of bureaucracies and structures of kind of disability services. You know, it's a place and a set of procedures that you have to navigate before you can get support. And what typically happens for me is that they'll see my chair and they'll sort of, that will be recognized, but the fact that my autism stops me from even being able to access their service, so things like, you know, phoning up to make an appointment, remembering when the appointment is, filling in forms for you know, disabled students allowance and things like that, and even just initiating the fact that I have needs, as it were, are things that are inaccessible to me because of my autism. So that's like before I've even got to the idea of accessing support to be a student. And so I think that advocacy is particularly important for autistic people. One of the things that I've worked on with, I mentioned that I work for Leeds Autism AIM, and for AdvoNet more widely. And one of the things that we've done over the last kind of 18 months, we got funding from the Government Equality Office to do an advocacy and self-advocacy kind of project and set of courses and kind of workshops and things for, now it was a big project. It was for autistic people or people with learning disabilities or people with mental health issues or combinations of those, who were also members of LGBTQ populations. Mm-hmm. And we were looking specifically at how those groups accessed healthcare. And the whole project was taking an advocacy and a self-advocacy approach. So we ran courses where people got together and kind of discussed their own experiences of trying to access healthcare and what worked and what didn't work, and people got the chance to kind of practice things and even just to have that space of thinking together. And, you know, because sometimes when you're on your own, you don't actually realize that you're being oppressed or that you're being discriminated against. You kind of feel like you must be just getting it wrong. Yeah. So one of the things with self-advocacy, which is kind of the idea of, rather than somebody else advocating for you or helping you to do that, it's about how you yourself put forward your needs and put forward your preferences and say what you want and basically exercise your own autonomy. And quite often the way that happens in practice is that we get together and we have kind of groups where we can discuss together what our experiences are and how we think we might speak up for ourselves. And it creates a kind of really safe place where you can articulate those things and realize that you're not on your own, basically, that other people experience it. And so one of the things that we found out when we were running these courses for, particularly for autistic people, was that of all the, because we did surveys about what people's experiences had been, you know, before they did self-advocacy courses, and one of the biggest things was that people were identifying that clinicians and professionals and other non-autistic people not understanding their autism was the barrier to accessing support, beyond kind of other issues like maybe sexual identity or, you know, other things. It was that fundamental not understanding of autism. And that actually means that I'd just like to kind of think about what that actually means and the implications, because it's far wider. I think it's far wider than just what happens when you go into a doctor's office and they don't get it. Because, like, if we're autistic, well, as far as we understand it, we're born autistic, and autism affects us kind of on such a basic kind of sensory and kind of internal level that to me it kind of shapes every experience that we have, every interaction that we have, right from the word go. And if that's the case, and if we are made aware right from the start that our way of being and doing and experiencing the world is not the same as other people's, then that has implications for how we actually voice our own experiences and our needs and preferences. I wrote something a couple of years ago that kind of sums this up. So if it's okay, like, I'm just going to read a quick kind of couple of sentences.
Absolutely, go ahead.
So what I said was that if you are a person who is interacting with an autistic person, or if you've got autistic people in your life that you care about, that you work with, in order to kind of understand how we experience the world and kind of relating to other people, what I said was that you need to know that from our very earliest attempts at communication, we are often told that our sensory and emotional expressions are wrong. We are told that cuddles are supposed to be pleasant, even if to us they are painful. We are told that busy, loud environments that hurt every part of our bodies and make us either run, curl up, or lash out are fun. And we're told that it's important to look at people's eyes when we talk to them, even if to us this is painful. We are told that the ways in which we do conversations are wrong. We're told that the ways in which we do relationships are wrong. We are told that our passions and enthusiasms are wrong. We are told that we are wrong. And to me, it's kind of like we often talk about ABA, applied behavioural analysis, within the autistic community, and we talk about the potential for kind of harm and trauma that can happen when compliance is the goal, or kind of being, you know, as Love has described it, indistinguishable from our peers is the goal. It's essentially harmful to have to suppress your own very fundamental experiences and needs and perform what is expected of the world. But it's not just those of us who experience ABA that have that experience, I don't think. To me, the world around us, the neurotypical world, kind of interacts as a kind of constant ABA therapy. So, you know, right from being small, if I said something hurt me and I was told, no, it doesn't, it's okay, you know, it's fine, that's a denial of my experience. So the next time I want to say something hurts, I've got in my head that actually my experience of pain is not reliable. So how can I then, next time, you know, if I'm with a doctor and they say, can you tell me if this hurt? I don't know, because I don't know really what hurt is. I don't know what it is in your head or according to the world. So I don't know what to say. And so to me, there's a starting point of advocacy and self-advocacy, doing it for ourselves in autism, that means that actually we need to get to a point where we trust our own voices and our own experiences.
That's hugely important, and also you need to trust that those will be heard.
Absolutely.
Wanted to. Jill, we're getting loads of interest on the live feed, and I know for people who are maybe worried they're not going to get an answer, I know that you're going to jump on afterwards in response, but there's a really interesting one here, which I think is a fairly fundamental piece around self-advocacy, and it's Kathy who's asking how you respond to people who doubt or challenge your diagnosis. That's a very fundamental question. So what advice would you give Kathy?
It's hard to sum it up. I think the first thing that I would say is I would just want to confirm that experience is one that is really painful for when we experience it as autistic people. It's something that I kind of internalized for a lot of years, and I thought that my inability to appear autistic in the way that the world expects me to meant that actually my autism really wasn't that severe, as we might say. And actually that was kind of compounded by the fact that my diagnosis says that I have mild autism. Well, my original one does. I have a subsequent one that says it's not mild, but you know, so that kind of became part of what sort of quietened my own autistic voice, because I actually bought into that. So the first thing I would say is that I think that if we're going to put ourselves out there in the world and go against the stereotypes and risk that kind of denying our own identity, then we need to make sure that we've got places where we can say, hey, do you know what, I got another one today, another "you don't look autistic." We make it into a kind of catchphrase among ourselves, and that happens. So to me, I experienced that on Twitter, because like you, I'm kind of big on autistic Twitter, and we can kind of go into that space and say, oh, it happened again, and somebody else will jump on and give their experience, and so we know that it's not just us. So I think that's the first point, that in dealing with it, we have to make our own spaces where we share. I mean, it's like the women's movement did with consciousness raising, right? We need to actually get to a point where we know that it's not just us, right? So that's definitely part of it. Find your tribe, even if that's not, autistic Twitter, even if it's somewhere where, you're doing another interest and you've got somebody else where you can just say, oh, this keeps happening and I don't like it. In terms of how you deal with it in the moment, so when the person says it, one of the things that I found a useful strategy quite early on was developing my own script. So doing this away from the time when I'm being challenged. And this is something that I do in general. I think a lot of us, we deal with our own delayed processing and delayed kind of and our own issues with interaction by scripting and memorizing and learning by rote things that we can say in the moment. And that's what I did to deal with this issue. So I created just a couple of sentences when someone was questioning it, that really explained what my autism meant to me, and how it was that actually I was autistic, even though they weren't seeing it. And those sentences are going to be different for everybody, but definitely doing that. I think a lot of what we think of as advocacy, we tend to focus on in the moment when we're doing the interaction, but often, especially for autistics, I think a lot happens behind the scenes in our thinking and our planning and our role playing. One thing I'd like to add, though, is that I think it's really important that we remember that we don't need to put all our personal details and personal experiences and personal the things that happen with our bodies and our minds. We don't have to put all that out there, because we don't have to pass somebody's test to convince them that we're autistic. That's our information. That's up to us. And if somebody doesn't see it, that's because they don't know a lot about autism. It's not because we haven't convinced them. So I think people might want to think, when they're planning their script, that rather than saying, oh, I have autism because I do this, this, and this, which is stuff that I've done in the past, and I've put loads of myself out there that sometimes I wish I hadn't. We can flip it, and we can say, well, actually, it's in our history, it's been really difficult for people to recognize autism, and now we're beginning to understand it more, and we're beginning to find that actually, for some of us, identifying in this way is helpful in terms of shaping how we live our lives and how we access the social world. So yeah, it's about kind of planning how you want to present yourself without kind of putting too much of yourself at stake, and just reminding yourself that your own identity is your business.
Yeah, brilliant advice. Absolutely brilliant advice. And I know there's been a few issues around that raised on the feed. Helen's reminding everybody the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance has a database of advocacy services across Scotland. Lots of people finding what you're saying very affirming.
Can I just thank Helen for putting that out there, because one of the things is that because obviously I'm English, and I have the information about how independent advocacy works in England, particularly statutory advocacy as well. So people who lack capacity to make decisions or are in the mental health system. But obviously Scotland's system is very different, and I can't really speak to that other than the kind of the basics that I can find out. So thanks, Helen.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And this, we're talking really about the concept just now, and our advice line is there for backup if anybody wants to get in touch with the Scottish Autism Advice Line. Just moving on a little bit, talked about advocacy, a bit about self-advocacy, but there's that element which I think is brilliant and across the autistic community is the sort of activism element, and then the pragmatism element, the getting mobilised to actually do something. And you were mentioning about Escape, in this week, and that kind of thing. It's absolutely brilliant. Tell us a wee bit about your views around activism and what that can bring for autistic people.
Absolutely. So this is something that's really kind of developed for me in my own work, my own understanding, and I've kind of grown alongside the autistic community as we've kind of discovered ourselves and got together. I mean, to say that, I've had like various times in my life where I've been told that autistic community is kind of an oxymoron, that it's an impossibility, that we can't do it because we're not social, because we don't communicate properly, we can't build community, we wouldn't want to, because of course we don't want friends, right? Some of us might not, but it's not a defining aspect of autism, right? And I think that's an important point to make before we start talking about autistic community, that actually it's not something that all autistic people want to engage in or feel they need to engage in. I've got autistic friends who hate the idea of being lumped together with people by what they see as a diagnostic label. My way of seeing it is slightly different, because I think that the point of having a community, particularly a social or political community, which is what I see the autistic community as being, is not just that it's about us making our own space separate to the rest of the world. And I think we really need to be careful about that, because it can be so tempting when we find each other and we're excited because we're all, like Autiscape is probably the biggest example. It's so enriching and empowering to be in a place where, you're just taken for granted. You don't have to always spell everything out. It's liberating, and we do need more of that. But we don't want to ghettoize ourselves. We don't want to, for example, the autistic LGBT community, we don't want to be saying, most LGBT social stuff is inaccessible for a lot of autistics, because it happens around, club scenes and bars and things, and it's not really where we're at. But that doesn't mean that we need to shut ourselves away and do our own separate autistic LGBT thing. It means that we, as an autistic LGBTQ plus community, need to be saying to the rest of the LGBT community, actually, there's a subgroup within your community that has a particular set of needs and preferences, and can we create some space for ourselves within your community? Just like what's happened with feminism, that Black feminists, for example, have done work around the fact that mainstream feminism is potentially is a white space. So rather than saying that Black feminists exist over here and are something separate, we need to make space within the wider community, and so that's what I see the main role of kind of autistic community as being. It's about shaping the world out there and challenging oppressions and discrimination kind of out there, and that's where our focus needs to be. I think we get very hung up, and I think this comes from the kind of the medicalization of autism, and the fact that we're used to seeing it in that very kind of, what as a researcher I think of in kind of positivistic terms, as though autism is a thing that we're out there looking for, like it's a gene or it's something that we need to define. And I think we bring that into our communities, and we try, and to me it feels a little bit like navel gazing, right? We're hung up on the detail of what autism is and what counts and what doesn't, whereas actually, to me, the idea is that if you experience if you find that the identification of autism is helpful to describe how you experience the world and how you would like to change the world, then autistic politics is kind of and activism is a good place to start for you.
Yeah.
I know, I want to be clear that I know that we say very, very carefully that there's no such thing as being a little bit autistic. But one of the things I've learned over time has been that a lot of the things that we as autistic people are advocating for, things that help other people who are not autistic as well. And that's another reason why I think autistic voices need to be part of the main community, because we've got stuff to contribute. Rita Jordan talks about autistic people often as being like the canaries in the mine, like we're kind of, because we tend to be very sensitive to social and sensory experiences, like we're particularly affected by things, particularly disabled by things, so we kind of need them to change, right? But other people who are not autistic don't like having music on in bars, for example, because they want to have a conversation. One of the things that I think is that non-autistic people would also get on board alongside us, because as long as we're the ones doing all the advocating, like it's seen as being the autistic community saying turn the music down, as a crude example, it's something that makes us look like we're the ones with the problem. And we're the ones who we've already got the diagnostic label, so we're already kind of stigmatized and out there. But actually, if if, for example, like if somebody's a friend of mine or a colleague of mine and they know that I can't go in a room that has, I don't know, fluorescent lights or loud music, they might want the music turning down or something, and I just wish they'd go up to the person, the bartender or the staff or whatever, and say, actually, the noise in here might be quite difficult for some people. I know, for example, some autistic people find this really challenging, and that they, from their position, their non-autistic position of kind of privilege, actually signpost to us and our community and what they've learned from us and things. That's how I like it to work. It's not speaking for us. It's not like saying, it's not.
Yeah.
It's pointing in the direction of our voices and kind of, bigging them up.
Isn't it? We're coming towards the end of our time, but I want to give you a little bit of time to talk about your fantastic initiative, your Autistic Mutual Aid Fund.
Okay. So this is if we want a practical example of how autistic to autistic advocacy and mutual aid might work, and I haven't really talked enough, or as much as I would have wanted to, about why I think that's such an important model as opposed to service provision and the kind of more formal, even though I think there's a place for that. Us doing it for ourselves and with ourselves, I think is a statement of empowerment, because it tells us, ourselves, each other, that we care about each other, and it also tells the wider world that we are a community and that we exist as a social presence rather than just as a set of diagnostic criteria. So the Autistic Mutual Aid Fund is a thing that I set up at the start of the lockdown of COVID-19. You can find it if you just Google. It's a GoFundMe page. So you just Google Autistic Mutual Aid Fund, or if you're on Twitter, the hashtag is AMA Fund, and you'll find all my posts and links to it. Basically what it is that I was aware at the start of lockdown that a lot of autistic advocates, activists were going to be losing work because events were cancelled, things like that. And so I thought this is an opportunity that we can get together and help each other out a bit. So the fund exists basically to give small grants to autistic people, activists, advocates who do things around the year for our community, and we all benefit from their work. But now they're having a bit of a hard time. So we're giving small grants of up to £250 a time, although people can apply multiple times as long as we've got money in the fund. And and it's basically to do specific things that make life a little bit easier. So that might be paying a difficult bill, or it might be buying some sensory equipment that is just going to make life more comfortable. We've also funded, so came across one particular activist, Tyler Grant, who is doing really good things about her experiences as a Black autistic woman, and she's got a YouTube channel and a website, but she's been funding stuff herself from her own income, and she needed some new equipment, and we were able to kind of support that, so we're supporting her activism as well. You should check out her stuff as well because it's good. She's just one example of lots of others that we've just managed to make life a bit easier. And I think I want to stress that it's not about people being, you don't have to be desperate to apply. You don't have to be, it's not about going for the people who, helping the people who are, you know, like usually when you apply for things, you have to be like really desperately in need.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of people are really hesitant to apply. I think it's really a testament to autistic and autism communities. I think that we've had so many people giving, like, you know, routinely giving, but actually getting people to apply is a much more difficult issue, you know. But yeah, it's something that I'm really passionate about. We're kind of beginning to think about how we might take it forward, sort of looking at kind of reducing the link with COVID-19 and things. I think I'll blog about that on my Voice Spaces blog at some point and try and ask what people think, because it'll need a bit more. At the moment, it's my friend Emma Kendall and I are kind of doing it all. I did all the admin and we both look at all the applications, but if it's going to go forward, it'll perhaps need more of an infrastructure. So I'll be kind of asking people about that in the future, I think, in the near future.
Brilliant. It's such a brilliant initiative. So if you can support it, or if you feel that you might benefit from support from it, please look up. Jill, that's us out of time. There's loads of comments on the Facebook page, and I know you're going to jump on. Thanks to everybody who watched and commented, and you'll be able to see this on our Facebook page later. So it was a brilliant session. Appreciate your time, Jill. Thanks very much.
We should thank Kerry Ann as well, who's your colleague who's done all the tech.
She has. Kerry Ann is used to me and my terrible ways of behaving when we're doing seminars and things in public, but this virtual thing has really knocked me for six. So she is, you're dead right, Jill. Thanks, Kerry Ann, who's in the background, and thanks to everybody for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.